Okay, so our topic is retrograde planets, and I've called them a mystery because sometimes their behavior is quite mysterious, right? And, like with anything in Jyotish, in my Jyotish career, which now is lasting almost 30 years, I've always been looking for reliable interpretive principles. And what I mean by that is that an interpretive principle will work, say, 70, 80% of the time, 7 to 8 times out of 10, right? This is what I would call a reliable interpretive principle. And so I've been searching for that my entire Jyotish career with regards to retrograde planets, all right? And in that first part that you all received, I mentioned some interpretive principles with regards to the retrograde planets that I have found to be reasonably reliable. Does anybody want to mention what some of those were that are in the first part in the article? What are some principles that I've seen as being pretty reliable? Anyone?
A retrograde planet,
You all read the article, yes?
a retrograde planet
Yes,
from the previous sign.
Well, this is something that, of course, K.N. Rao taught, something that might seem controversial to some. As I told you, I sort of resisted the idea at first. I didn't like the idea because it makes Saturn influencing so many more houses in my chart. But I am now of the opinion that it is, in fact, a valid principle and is something that should be taken into account. But I've told students not to accept this as some sort of dogma, but something that they should test out with regards to their own charts or charts that they work on and see if they feel that it's valid as well. But that is something that was brought out in the article and with illustrations. What else?
retrograde planets,
retrograde.
Neelima, good to see you. Go ahead. What did you say?
Thank you. Namaste. Retrograde planets, even if they are benefics and retrograde, they are not protective. They do not protect.
Right. So this idea that retrograde benefics will not protect as they normally might were they not retrograde. And again, I illustrated this and again have found this to be a very reliable principle. Dr. Chark, K.S. Chark, in his medical astrology books brings out this idea. That's where I first came across it, but I've really tested it and I've found it to be quite true. Anything else that people recall?
Yeah, retrograde planet have high level of chestabal.
Say it again.
Chestabal. It is having chestabal.
So, there's this idea that retrograde planets, that it's a source of strength. And that comes from the idea that in Chestabal, emotional strength, it gets a full additional rupa and therefore has a higher value that way. And in keeping with the idea that retrograde planets are the ones closest to the Earth and therefore may exert more influence. I mentioned that K.N. Rao, this is not a principle K.N. Rao taught, but other teachers that I respect, people like Hart Defoe and people like his students, people like Penny Farrow and so forth. I know some of you have studied with them, always talk about this as being a source of strength for a planet. And I would go along with that, especially with regards to when a natural malefic is retrograde. You should see it as being aspecting more malefically even than when it's not retrograde. And I mentioned that when it's a part of some Arishta Yoga combination, then you'll find that its aspect, again, is harsher, is more difficult, is more problematic, is more of an affliction, you might say. So these were things that were mentioned. Anything else?
Mark, I had a question. Yeah.
Okay.
I think Pulak had a hand up, so let him go first and then I'll go later.
Pulak?
No, I just wanted to say, Mark, you've quoted K.N. Rao saying that these things have to be seen in the context of the overall chart, right? And so I think that becomes important.
True. And, is there some thought you're having additionally about that, or just want to mention that? Is it just...
things like whether there are additional sources of strength,
absolutely.
and
Right.
things like that, yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Anything else that I was bringing out as being a potentially reliable principle in the thing?
Mark,
you had a question. Okay.
Yeah,
so.
Mark, I had a question that, the retrograde planets in Gemini, do you use that same, if the previous sign, do you use it or you...
I never saw K.N. Rao refer to it, so the answer is no.
Okay.
And remember, the aspects in Gemini are sign aspects.
Yeah.
So, not planetary aspects. So it's not a consideration.
Okay.
Anything else? I started by sort of debunking the idea that I get asked a question a lot about because of these verses in Uttara Kamalitra that a retrograde debilitated planet somehow gives the results of an exalted planet, and a retrograde exalted planet somehow gives the results of a debilitated planet. This will not hold true in 7 out of 8 cases, or 7 out of 10 cases, and you have to be very careful about this. And so I showed examples where this was obviously not true. Joe Biden's exalted Vargotama retrograde Jupiter being one of them, right? Now, I also sort of brought out the idea, not in a main way, but maybe more so in the next part, that could it be that a retrograde planet, the natural significations suffer, right? Such that if you have a retrograde Venus, this could be an unfavorable point with regards to marriage and your love life, right? If you have a retrograde Jupiter, this could be an unfavorable point with regards to karma with children, and so on. This idea will be explored sort of more in part 2, right? So any other thoughts or questions about anything that was in part 1 of the article before we go on and start looking at charts?
Mark, just
So-
clarify. Sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. No, you go ahead and I'll ask my question later.
You'll consider the aspect from the previous house in divisional charts as well, right?
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Mark,
Yes, go ahead.
can I
Nina.
ask?
Please.
Retrograde planets, Svarashi, right? We talked about retrograde exalted planets,
Right.
but I've seen Jupiter in Sagittarius and retrograde. How do they Svarashi and retrograde?
Well, again, you're going by your teacher, one of your teachers, right? You would say this is as a double source of strength, right? It's both in its own sign, or Mula Trikona sign, maybe if it's within the first 10 degrees, and it's also retrograde, so it has 2 sources of strength. And again, I don't dispute this, okay? Every student or every teacher had their teacher, and they tend to teach in the style in which they were taught, right? So again, I mentioned that this was not a principle that K and Rao taught, but I know it. There's a valid basis for it, and so I don't dispute it, and I would take it as being true. So, but again, if that Jupiter in Sagittarius is retrograde, it may not protect, for example, in the way in which it otherwise might if it was not retrograde. That I found to be true, right? All right.
Several examples. Yes.
Somebody else had a question. No.
Mark, can I ask, please?
Please, Rohit.
Mark, when you said protect, that mainly you are saying health issues?
No. Well, most of the examples you've seen is with regards to health issues. So you've got some Arishta Yoga, and it has the additional aspect of Jupiter, or Jupiter's in an angle, some things that would typically produce Arishta Bhanga, and it won't reliably do that if it's retrograde. But I'm talking even if the benefic, Jupiter is a natural benefic, and its aspect is typically benefic, right?
Yes.
And therefore is a good source of a favorable feature on some planet that's getting that aspect. Well, my experience is that this Jupiter is retrograde, maybe not necessarily so. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm referring to. Does that clear up that idea? In fact, since you raised that question, let me just pull up my program, okay? And I want to, show you an example of what I'm talking about. I always like to teach through illustration. And program's not coming up yet. I always have to do this twice. I always mention this. Let me know when a chart appears. Right?
It's appeared, Mark.
All right, but this is not the chart that I want to talk about at the moment. So some of you, maybe who take private tutoring from me, have already seen this example, but this is the chart. When I was recently teaching a program in Bodrum, Turkey, it was mainly students from Russia, because I don't go teaching in Russia anymore. A lot of them were students that I'd known before from times that I was teaching. There's a woman who lives in Moscow, and she always attended my classes there when I was teaching in Moscow. And you can see that she has been running the period of the sun, okay, since about a year ago. Now, what good things could you say about the sun in terms of some sort of yogic type result it might show the potential for giving?
Lagna Lord in the 10th house, Digbala, will
Right.
give good results in career.
So one could draw the interpretation from this that the sun, as the Lagna Lord, getting directional strength in the 10th house, could bring good results professionally. And then what additional influences does it get?
Jupiter
Jupiter.
and full moon aspect.
So you get the aspect of Jupiter, a natural benefic, right? And not a bad planet for this Lagna in terms of it ruling the 5th, but also the 8th. And then from a very full moon. This might support the idea of the sun giving some good benefit this way professionally. But, what could be wrong with this picture, starting with the degrees of the sun?
It's Sandhi.
It's in an extreme Sandhi, right? So we have these things called the Baladi Avastas. Maybe I haven't referred to them that much, different planetary states. And when a planet is in a pretty extreme Sandhi at the very beginning of the sign and the sign, this is kind of an unstable kind of condition, right? And not a favorable condition. And then what else could be? Well, let me just state that one of the reasons she wanted me to give input about her sun major period is that thus far, within the first year and some months, it's not been a good period at all. A lot of misfortune, some of that related to her professional life. Her and her husband have owned a business. They've had a very key employee, someone who's been the general manager of the business, and they've lost this person, and it's had a major impact on their business life. So a negative impact here. Does anybody see anything going on with the sun here that could account for something like that?
Mark, couple of observations. Obviously, Jupiter as the 8th lord aspects the 10th house. And then the degrees of Saturn, they are like,
This is what I wanted people to see. And you'll notice that the sun at 2833, Saturn in the 028 of Gemini forms a conjunction less than a degree. Saturn being not only a natural malefic, but also the 6th lord of this birth chart, not a good planet for this Lagna at all, also rules the mark of 7th. And of course, Saturn is the bitter enemy of the sun. So actually, this is quite an affliction to the sun that easy to miss. And the lesson here, and I've learned it a long time ago, that you have to pay attention to conjunctions that happen across signs, as in this case. Now, coming back to your question, Rohit, Jupiter here would normally be a fairly benign and favorable additional influence. But look what the condition of this Jupiter, its course in its debilitation side. Does anybody see any obvious factor for cancellation?
Exaltation Lord in Kendra.
Exaltation Lord is in a Kendra, right? So that is one factor, but not what I would call the most effective kind of cancellation. But my point here, related to your question, is that this Jupiter's retrograde. And when I say Jupiter retrograde will not necessarily protect, I don't just mean that with regards to, protecting a planet, protecting a condition, health condition, but just also, being a highly favorable influence on a particular graha, in this case, the sun. Really, this Jupiter is not that helpful here. I'm not saying it doesn't give any benefit that way, but not much. And the moon here is very exalted. I mean, is very bright, but very full, but it's also in its debilitation sign, and it's the 12th lord.
Yeah.
And then, you have to see, since some of the impact here has been, sort of professionally, right? Then you have to see D10 And then what do you notice about the sun in D10?
Debilitated and in a termination house.
Under affliction without benefic influence.
Yeah.
So, these are the reasons why this,
Wow.
which is not to say that there won't be any, good result of this being the Lagna Lord in the 10th in direction of strength. But you have to temper that quite a bit based on these other considerations. So,
Forms of Papa Sankhya Yoga also with Saturn.
talk about that. Talk about that, Nilma, because not everyone's familiar with that concept.
Okay. Papa Sankhya Yoga is when two planets are in like 3rd or 11th, 4th or 10th, 5th or 9th. If there's a benefic in one and malefic in the other, it's Mishra Papa Sankhya Yoga or Mishra Sankhya Yoga rather. And the two benefics, it will be Shubha Sankhya Yoga. But here it's being debilitated. Sun with Ketu in the 3rd and Saturn in the 11th will make a Papa Sankhya Yoga, and Sun Dasha can be challenging.
Right. So, I wrote an article once called The Numbers Benign, which was all about these Sankhya yogas, which get applied to divisional charts. So this is good recognition on your part. So the sun period here is going to have some real challenges with respect to her professional life and might undergo rather major changes. It wouldn't be beyond the possibility that the business might fail during this time. I certainly hope not, but that could be one indication here. Okay. So I want to go back now. Is there a question here? Question?
Mercury
Mark
Jupiter
here.
form a Shubha Sankhya Yoga.
So say again, Nilima.
Mercury and Jupiter form a Shubha Sankhya Yoga, unlike Sun and Saturn, the
Yeah,
opposite.
so here, again, you put your point on the ascendant and then you go out 2 from each side. So it would be 2, 12, 3, 11, 4, 10, 5, 9, 6, 8. And what she's seeing here is that you have 2 benefics, Jupiter here in strength and then Mercury, 6, 8. Actually, this is one of the ways in which planets in Dushtana houses within divisional charts can get, you might say, redeemed. I show examples of that in that article that I mentioned. Anyone else a question before we go on?
Mark, would you also take these Sankhya Yogas as an Antardasha Lord too? Or only for the major Lord?
Well, I'll just be honest and say my experience with working with them and predicting on their basis has been mostly as a major period, but theoretically they of course should apply to a sub period as well. But of course, sub periods always happen within the context of a major period.
Yeah, true.
Another question?
Yeah, Mark, you had talked about Saturn and Sun being conjunct because of their degrees, but in different signs. Can this concept be also transferred to Gandanta planets?
I'm not sure what you're asking. I mean, could they happen when the planet is also in a Gandanta position? Is that what you're asking?
No, just say that 2 planets not in a Sandhi, but were just a Gandanta. In other words, the degrees are not just within one, but they're in between, 320 on each side. Would that still be a conjunction?
Well, again, I mean, sort of Gandanta is a particular type of Sandhi, right? And not a favorable one. So let's take an example. Say a planet is at the 29 degrees of Pisces and 1 degree of Aries, which you'd see in the chart of the British actress Julie Christie. They are obviously in Gandanta positions, but they're also conjunct by degrees. Is this the kind of scenario you're asking about?
Yes. And is it because one is in a Sandhi?
Well, no, it's just in order for planets to be conjunct across signs, one of them has to be at the very beginning of the sign and one of them has to be at the very end of the sign. So in other words, they're always going to be in Sandhis. If the positions that they're in relate to the fire and the water sign, they're going to be Gandanta Sandhis, right?
Yes, thank you. And what would that degree be before they are not conjunct?
Oh, you mean what would be the orb?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, my comment about that would be that the closer, the more they're conjunct. For the planets themselves, I wouldn't go beyond, say, a 4-degree conjunction, maybe a little more for the sun and the moon. But again, just, the examples I highlight are the ones where they're very close degrees.
Thank you.
Since we're talking about this, I'm going to just go on a little bit of a tangent here. You've all heard me say that, Jyotish will teach you Jyotish, meaning, just by working on charts, you come to realize certain things. So I'm pulling up the chart of a very famous TV journalist, a woman by the name of Barbara Walters, okay? And TV journalism is a function of the third house, third lord, right? You're like giving a performance, you're like an actor in a certain ways. And she was very successful, in fact, kind of broke the glass ceiling, but prior to her, most prominent major network TV journalists were all men. She sort of broke through that and was one of the first women in a prominent position that way. Now look at her Mercury and her Mars, right? So Mercury, of course, is the first and the 10th lord. Mars is the third lord. And you'll see that by sign, they're not conjunct. But if you look at their degrees, you'll see that they're actually, again, less than a degree conjunct. And in this case, they're both Vargotama, right? And this is the 1-3-3-10 combination in her chart that reflects who she did become professionally and then actually the success she had in that. And you'll see back, if you look at the Vimshotri Dasha starting in 1985, she ran Mercury. It was in the latter part of her career, but actually it was the time when she was most successful and famous this way. So, this chart, which I worked on very early in my career in Jyotish, taught me the lesson about this. And it's the lesson I'm teaching here. Sandeep, question?
Yeah, Mark, request if you could send that article on Papa Sankhya and Shubha Sankhya, if you could send it to us.
Sure, that's extra, Sandeep, but I'll sure do that. No, I'm just,
Yeah.
I'd be happy to do that. I'll send that out. But we're getting a little far afield here. I want to come back to retrograde planets. And I'm going to pull up this chart. This is a chart I've been asked to work on for some time and have given a number of predictions. It's the chart of the daughter of a very a close woman friend of mine. And you've probably seen it because I've used it at times to illustrate different things. But, you should be seeing chart now with Gemini Lagna, correct? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So focusing on Jupiter, it's, of course, a retrograde debilitated planet in the 8th house. And here I want to speak about this more in terms of potential influence on one's karma with children, right? Jupiter being the natural significator of children. And my point being here that being in a sign of debilitation, being in the 8th house, and being retrograde is a pretty unfavorable sort of condition of Jupiter in terms of its karaka significations as it relates to children. And then what's also problematic about the 5th house, 5th lord?
8th lord in the 5th.
So
Eight-
Saturn's
eighth lord in the 5th.
Saturn here is somewhat paradoxical, isn't it? It's a good 9th lord, moved to 9th lord, but it's also the 8th lord in the 5th house. And then it has additional affliction, right? Rahu Ketu axes. And then what about the 5th lord?
5th lord aspects Jupiter.
So Jupiter and Venus, the 5th lord is in a mutual aspect with Jupiter, but also what else is happening with this Venus?
Papa Kalsri.
Well, I wouldn't, maybe.
It's aspected by Saturn.
Yeah, the problem is aspect of Saturn. Right?
Yes.
So you've got a strong influence of natural malefics on the 5th house, 5th lord, while at the same time Karaka Jupiter's in this condition. So from a static potential point of view, having children, the experience of children is going to be understandably quite challenging. Now, paradoxically, and I think people have heard me talk about this, even if Saturn is an affliction to the 5th house, if it's in the 5th house And if it's connected to the fifth lord, ironically, that period and sub-period can actually bring a child. And it did. I predicted that this person would have a child in Saturn, Venus with difficulty and with potential problems and complications, which turned out to be true. But they were able to have a child. Now, her and her husband have wanted to have more children since then. This goes back to 2017. So it's now what? It's now 7 years later. And even with the in vitro process, they were able to conceive, but it ended up in a stillbirth. And due to some complications related to that stillbirth, doctors indicated to her that she would not be able to have any more children, even through the in vitro process. But we live in a modern era where certain things can be overcome in different ways. So you can see that as of this last June, this person entered into Saturn Rahu. So when the Rahu Ketu axis is influencing the fifth house, fifth lord, what's one of the things in the modern context that this can mean in terms of how one gets a child?
Adoption.
Certainly adoption is a possibility, but this is not an option.
Surrogate,
Intervention.
house involved.
So I heard someone say surrogate, and that's exactly what is happening.
And Rahu's involved, right? So new technology.
Right. So in other words, they take the egg of the mother and the sperm of the father, and through the in vitro process, a conception happens, and that is then implanted in the womb of another woman who serves as a surrogate. Now, the first attempt of doing this was not successful. Again, you just have to see all the problematic factors here related to Jupiter in the fifth house, fifth lord. Just recently, it was attempted again, and so far is a success. And, I hope for their sakes that it does result in carrying the child to term and then able to have another child. But it's a dicey, risky sort of thing with regards to this chart. And I'm highlighting here again this debilitated retrograde Jupiter in the eighth house. And even the child that they have has been, he's a wonderful kid in many ways, but he's been having real behavioral problems, is seen as being on the spectrum autistically. He's been invited not to reattend certain schools that he was a part of. So, fifth is a challenge here.
Mark, can we see the Saptamsha, please?
Yes, of course. So again, one of the reasons that I had suggested that Saturn Rahu might actually then bring another child in this way has to do with the placement and condition of these planets here, right? Both are in an angle. Rahu is in the Lagna here, and Saturn does get the influence of two natural benefics, Mercury and Jupiter. But it's also in its debilitation sign. There is some cancellation if you take this fact that Mars as the sign lord is aspecting, and it remains to be seen, but there's a good reason to be hopeful. So any other thoughts or questions on this chart before we move on?
Yeah.
Mark,
Georgie?
yeah, so you published this chart first time, at least I saw it first time in the Dangerous Y Zones article. And basically it was in regards to this person was working in the legal profession. And then when she started Saturn Moon, she was hired at a much more prestigious firm for much higher compensation, right?
You have a very good memory, Georgie.
The reason I have a good memory is because I'm Gemini ascendant, I'm in Saturn Mahadasha, and I'm starting Saturn Moon in December next year.
I see.
But what struck me is I look at the situation around Jupiter as the 10th lord, and what I see is Dur Yoga and Shakata Yoga.
Right.
So I was just curious, was there any kind of volatility, interruption, breaks in her career life, problems?
And, the interesting thing about this Jupiter in terms of, what we've talked about it thus far, does it give that great Parashara exception? Right? Debilitated planet in the 8th house.
Yes,
Yes,
it
it Lord
gives.
isn't strong, is it?
Sorry?
The Lagna Lord isn't strong. I thought that was part of it.
You know, Peter, in terms of what's given in the Shastra, it is a part of it. But, you know, I saw K and Rao applying this, whether that was true or not, and I've seen it to be likewise that way.
Okay.
But, you know, and she had quite a good career in the law. She works now for a very prestigious firm, and I think she was just recently made partner. But, you know, we're kind of getting off the topic here. So I kind of, unless there's something related to retrograde, I want to go on here. Go ahead.
So, you know, I mean, just I put my hand up. I just wanted to check with the, you know, did you check the husbands, you know, because sometimes I've observed in surrogates, you know, if someone's trying to surrogacy, it might not be shown in the woman's chart, but sometimes the husband's chart shows that potential for having a kid. So did you see it in this case, or have you seen the husband's chart, or I mean,
right now,
did you see it, or?
In most of my predictions I've made about, you know, childbirth, you know, of course, if I can involve the chart of the husband, I always do, and you want to see sort of the confluence that way. I don't have the chart of the husband in this case. There's no correct birth time, so it's not a consideration. You know, I do want to go on here. So I want to stop sharing screen here and pull up a document. So one of the principles that we were talking about in the first part is, does a planet retrograde then also influence from the sign previously? And, you know, I'd have to say that I've probably explored this most with regards to, say, Saturn as a natural malefic retrograde, and does it then, you know, influence from the sign previous? So you're looking at a chart of an Indian man who I encountered when I was teaching in Ahmedabad. He was actually an IT specialist that was helping us live stream the event and so on. Got to know him a little bit and got to know a little bit of his history. One thing that was very apparent is that he did not have the use of his, I think it was his left arm. And when I asked him about this, he talked about a motorcycle accident that he had been in at age 16 that left him without the use of that one limb. And, you know, where do you see the static potential in this chart for vehicular accidents, potentially related to personal injury also?
Mark, we are not seeing the chart, or at least I'm not.
Really? Well, that would help, wouldn't it? Okay, just testing you. Should be coming up now. You see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So my question was, where do you see the potential for vehicular accident also resulting in personal injury?
Lord of the fourth, Rahu is in the 4th house. So that's a big giveaway. And the Lord of the fourth is in the 12th.
So you're seeing
So-
the influence of Rahu, a natural malefic, on the 4th house. Is there any additional malefic influence?
And then Mars also aspects the 4th house. And Saturn, if you take it retrograde, it goes back. Then there would be a combination of Saturn, Rahu in the 4th house.
Right. And so for Virgo, Mars is not just the natural malefic, but also a highly malignant 3rd and 8th lord. 3rd house obviously has to do when you're being in transit, for example. And then Saturn becomes not just the 5th lord, but also the 6th lord. In other words, there'd be the influence of all natural malefics, Saturn, Rahu, Mars on the 4th house, two of which are the 6th and 8th lords, right? And what Mahadasha was this person born in? You can see his moon at 17.4 Aquarius. What Mahadasha were they born in?
Rahu.
Is Rahu Mahadasha?
In the Rahu Mahadasha, right? So, and then, you know, who is the natural significator of vehicles?
Venus.
Venus. And we see Venus here retrograde. given this idea that natural significations of a retrograde planet can suffer. Who's the fourth lord? It's Jupiter, right? What's going on with both of those planets?
Planetary war,
Planetary war, yeah.
What else?
combustion.
Combustion, right? And then Mercury, Lagna Lord in the 12th, while there's additional malefic influence on the Lagna. What do we call that?
Rishta.
Arishta Yoga, right? And so maybe you could see this potential without including the idea of Saturn retrograde also influencing from Sagittarius, that is just having Rahu there aspected by Mars, and I would accept that, but I believe that is an additional influence. Also, it's an additional influence on the Lagna then, right? With Mars there. And given the severity of what the injury was and how it had a life-altering effect, I think you have to see this as being correct. Right?
And the Lagna Lord is also retrograde.
Yes. So, since, well, I won't bring up the article again, but you saw a section there where I was talking about how, from the standpoint of medical astrology, retrograde planets, whether they be benefics or malefics, should always be considered as being adverse. And I was quoting from Dr. Char's books about the Lagna Lord being retrograde. So the fact that it's retrograde, it's in the 12th here, and there's additional malefic influence on the Lagna. This is, obviously in Arishta Yoga, it's with these benefics, right? But these benefics that are combust in a planetary war. Okay. So for anyone with Leo Lagna, Jupiter is ruling what? It's ruling the 5th and the 8th. Obviously, as a 5th trinal lord, it can give some good results, particularly Raja Yoga and Dana Yoga rights results, depending on who it's connected to. But whether or not it will give some bad results as it relates to its lordship of the 8th, what does this depend upon and why? People remember this principle? You may have heard me talk about it before. What do we really look for with regards to Jupiter in terms of whether it will or will not give bad results as it relates to the 8th house lordship?
Association of natural malefics.
And or certain house lords, right? So what happens to Jupiter when it's with Saturn for Leo is that, because it's also this impressionable 8th lord, when it's with Saturn as a natural malefic, who also happens to rule the 6th and the Marka 7th, this can be a bad combination. And of course, with Saturn also being sort of a Marka 7th lord. So here we have Jupiter strong in its own sign, forming actually some good yogas, angle trine combinations, also done yoga type combinations, but also with Saturn and getting the additional influence of Mars, who is what? Retrograde. And so one way of looking at this Jupiter is that it's a 8th lord that also gets the influence of Saturn, natural malefic, Mars, natural malefic. And Mars, of course, is also the Yogacaraka planet, forming some good yogas with these planets, but also has to be considered as an affliction. And which planet rules the kidneys astrologically? Anybody have an idea about that?
Venus?
Venus. And so you see that Venus here is part of what's being afflicted. This man basically had kidney failure in his major period of Jupiter, sub-period of Saturn, and had to have daily dialysis. And really is, at the time when this case was presented to me, they were going to need to have a kidney transplant in order to continue to survive. So again, it's just an example of how a natural malefic will aspect more malefically when it's retrograde. And I'm just going to show quickly a number of examples here. So what kind of planet is Mercury for Aries?
Very bad.
Third and sixth Lord, not.
It's a wholly functional malefic, right?
Mhm.
And of course, therefore, in its major periods, it can give problems health-wise. And then come to the sub-period of Venus. What sort of, I think you were remembering that article, Georgie, that entitled Dangerous Liaisons about major period of a trick house lord in the sub-period of a Maraka, in which there's then affliction, right?
Yeah.
So, come to the sub-period of Venus here. What's problematic about this Venus being a Maraka second lord?
It has the aspect of Saturn, or retrograde Saturn.
Well, first of all, it's with Mars,
Yes.
who's the Lagna lord, of course, is also the eighth lord. And then the reason I'm showing this example is that Saturn retrograde in Sagittarius, if you take it as aspecting also from Scorpio, then this Venus has the double affliction of both Saturn and Mars. And then where does it fall from Mercury? Venus.
Second house, Marakasthana.
Right. We should always remember, what's given in Parashara Hora about interpreting sub-periods from a major period. Talks about, if the sub-period lord falls in an angular trine, has all these good things to say. If it falls in Dhisthana, from there it has all these bad things to say. And then it says it falls in the second or seventh, then there might be danger to the life. This won't always be the case, but certainly it was the case here. And, the person basically passed away from cancer in Mercury, Venus, Mercury. But again, why am I showing you this? This retrograde Saturn aspecting also additionally from Scorpio, adding additional malefic influence onto the sub-period Lord Venus, a Maraka second and seventh Lord for this Lagna.
Mark, Venus doesn't aspect the ascendant, but it is within 1 degree. I mean, ascendant is 17 degrees, Venus is 16. I mean, still it's a planet which is really close degree to the ascendant. It's in trine. I mean, in its period, it can give something related to the physical body because the degree of the ascendant is in the Venus. Yeah.
Well, no, are you using
Oh.
Rashi? Are you using Rashi Drishti?
Mm-hmm. No. I actually said that Venus doesn't aspect, but still the degree is same. We should pay attention if two planets are ascendant and a planet has a close degree.
Ah, okay. All right.
And because we're talking about physical body, these things, and that's why I paid attention to the
I see. Okay.
ascendant degree. That's why.
Okay. All right. I understand. So, yet another example here. So what's the terrible Arishta here? I mean, it's really one of the worst I've seen in certain ways.
Eighth Lord in
All
Lagna.
Mhm.
Sixth and eighth Lord combination both in Lagna
Retrograde.
and retrograde.
So you've got the three worst natural malefics in the Lagna, Rahu, Mars, and Saturn. Mars and Saturn both retrograde, right? And they're not only influencing the Lagna, but they're aspecting onto the Lagna Lord, right? And but there is some saving grace here. Do people see what I'm referring to?
Jupiter.
as Jupiter.
Right. Not retrograde. So it does, in fact, produce some level of Arishtabhanga here. Not entirely, of course. And then, when you think about planetary periods, Mercury, when they run Mercury, then this is going to be bring out some of the worst potentials of that, right? Why would I say that other than the fact that Mercury is also the Lagna Lord with these afflictions? What makes Mercury additionally quite dangerous with regards to one's health and longevity?
It's
The Lagna-
afflicted by many malefics, and it's in the 7th Maraka house.
Right. It itself falls in the 7th Maraka house, right? And some of you may remember something that I quote frequently after having produced the commentary on the Lagna Parashari, where it talks about natural benefics in the 2nd and the 7th can become some of the surest killers. Of course, this is only going to be true when a person's ayus has expired. But obviously, certain sub-periods within the Mercury major period, what would be ones that would be exceptionally, well, there'd be a number of them that are exceptionally dangerous. I want to highlight Mercury, Saturn, and it was in this period. And so this person had been suffering from debilitating health problems for some time, and then, actually passed away in Mercury, Saturn. But again, just highlighting the fact that natural malefics as a part of an Arishta yoga make it worse, unfortunately.
Even the degrees of Saturn and Mars are so close to Mercury here.
Right. Look at Mercury at 27:36, Saturn at 22:25, only 11 minutes separate the two.
Mark, it's interestingly Saturn and Mercury both are Vargotam.
They are. And what this highlights is that, again, I wrote an article about Vargotama planets where I discussed this. Sometimes students take this as being a condition that, besides making a planet strong, necessarily makes a planet also highly favorable. Just not the case, right? What it does, it enables a planet to give its results strongly, whatever those results are. And that won't necessarily be favorable results. So you don't want to confuse strength with influence. Strength is just a measure of how strong a planet will give results. What type of influence it then has, therefore what kind of result it gives, depends on other additional factors. Just a last example this way. Can you see the danger in the Mercury K2 period and sub-period, and why?
Yeah, Mark, it's 212, and then the Mercury is a Maraka for a Pisces Lagna, and on top of that, Kendra-adhipati Dash, which is very bad for Mercury, and Venus has the 8th lord in second house of Maraka.
Well, all of what you said is relevant, but let me just go back to Mercury a bit more. So, just a planet becoming a primary Maraka won't necessarily create danger to the health in that period. But, however, if there's additional influence of natural malefics, and particularly natural malefics that rule trick houses, then almost invariably there will be. In which case here Mercury is with the Sun, the 6th lord. And why am I showing this example? Because it's also getting the aspect of Saturn retrograde, who's also a 12th lord, right? So this is a 7, 6, 7, 12 combination. Then come to the sub-period of K2, also becomes a primary Maraka, falling into second, with Venus, the 8th lord, and then falls in the 12th from Dasha Lagna, right? So it's a 2-12 relationship that way. But again, if you take Saturn retrograde as also aspecting from Libra, then this Venus-Ketu combination would also be under the influence of Saturn. So what happened? This man was out shopping with his wife at a farmer's market and basically had a stroke and fell over. And fortunately, he survived. He did have, for a period of time, speech problems and cognitive disruption, you might say, but in time was able to fully recover, but obviously very, very dangerous period and sub-period, and produced a very dangerous sort of condition. Where do we see, look at this Jupiter. Now, here's been an open question for me. This Jupiter is quite strong. Why?
It's Vargotami.
It's Vargotama, but what's its status? It's retrograde, right?
Yes.
It does aspect the Lagna, it does aspect Mercury, but you can say, well, it may be protected in the sense of that this event didn't kill him, but it certainly didn't prevent the event from happening. So in this case, I would say it is an example of a retrograde benefic, even a strong one, not protecting as it otherwise might.
Mark, Mercury is also, it's debilitated. Because it's, in Navamsha, it's debilitated too, so that also is a negative.
Sure, it went to its debilitation sign. It has had some weakness in the Vamsh. So now I want to bring up my program again.
Mark, I have a question.
Okay.
So basically, any planet, especially whenever the Lagnesha is retrograde, it kind of puts it diminishes the strength of a chart.
Well, I mean, it's not good from the health standpoint, Sonali.
Okay.
Just having a retrograde Lagna Lord, I wouldn't say, diminishes the quality or strength of a chart, particularly say, for example, I mean, if you take this idea that retrogression is actually a source of strength, but, all I'm looking at here and what I've been looking at in the examples I've been showing is from the health medical standpoint.
Right. So the medical point is, so the arishtas or the health is going to be affected.
Right.
Yeah.
So, exactly, in the chart of the IT person you hired, right? We saw the Lagna Lord retrograde in the 12th, while there's additional malefic influence on the Lagna itself. Makes the Arishta worse.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a chart that I've been giving input to for some time, and again, for different reasons. You may have seen this chart before. You can see that this person has been running Venus Mercury. Now, why does Parashara say Venus for Libra or for Taurus is the only Lagna Lord it doesn't classify as a as a functional malefic for the Lagna? Venus for Taurus is the only ascendant lord not classified in Parashara Hora as a functional benefic for that Lagna. Why?
It rules the 6th house.
Rules the 6th house as its Mula Trikona house.
Right.
And then one more reason that people tend to forget or to overlook, because he doesn't classify Mars for Scorpio that way.
Yes.
It also rules the 6th.
It suffers more because it's the benefic.
Good, Ruby. It's this idea of Kendra Adipati Dosh, right? That natural benefics ruling the angles suffer from this and they become less benefic. They don't become malefic, become less benefic, right? And that's it. So now you look at this Mercury-Venus combination here. Venus is retrograde. So what sort of yoga does it form?
Dana Yoga, 1, 2.
Forms in Dana Yoga. What other sort of yoga does it form?
Mark, it forms a Raja Yoga.
Yes. So Mercury is the 5th lord, and it's also in conjunct the Lagna lord, and they're happening in the good 9th house. Also, Dana Yoga, as Nilima said, it rules the 2nd and the 5th, and it's with the 1st lord, so that's Dana Yoga combination as well. Does Mercury here have any source of strength?
It's an exchange with Saturn.
An exchange with Saturn, good 5-9 exchange, right? And then producing more Dana Yoga type effect.
Trikona Raja, yeah.
Right, and also a Trikona Raja Yoga, Niyama, good. And if you take, so Mercury has a source of strength, and then if you take one, then so what would be, does Venus have any source of strength that you see here?
Retrograde and Swine D9.
Retrograde and Swan D9, so you could take it as having 2 sources of strength. So the conclusion would be that when they run the Mercury-Venus period activating these yogas, that these yogas would manifest, they'd have some juice, they would give some result, they'd give some Raja and Dana Yoga result, which is what I predicted this way back in 2018 when this person first came to me, and that definitely happened. But you all heard me talk about when you see a combination, you want to think about the best thing that this could mean. You also want to think about something unfavorable that it could also mean. So what could happen in Mercury-Venus not good health? Why could this be a dangerous? Let me rephrase that. Why could this also be seen as a dangerous period for the health and or for injury?
Because
Sonali, why don't you let Peter answer this one?
Yeah, Venus is the Lagna Lord, and Mercury is Maraka, and Venus is also the sixth Lord. So, we're looking at the sixth Lord, which is also the Lagna Lord being connected with Maraka, second Lord. So there could be some health issues as a result of that.
Right. Go back to that article I referred to. Major period of a Maraka, sub-period of a trick house lord. One that is also retrograde. Now, normally for such periods to give some bad result this way, normally you would see some influence of natural malefic as well. What happens when two planets exchange? Of course, they have a very strong influence each other. In fact, the Shastra says that this kind of sambandha is the strongest that there is, even stronger than a conjunction or a mutual glance. So whereas Mercury does this nice exchange with Saturn 5-9, and whereas it gives a source of strength for both, you also have to see both Mercury and Venus being under some influence of Saturn as well as a result of this exchange. So unfortunately, what happened is that this woman had a very freak accident where she fell down very awkwardly and broke a bone in her arm, displaced the bone, not just a fracture, where she had to undergo an operation. They had to put a plate in with screws, long recovery period, not use of the limb for a long time. This actually happened in her Venus-Mercury period, which again might be surprising, but it's an example of how, a certain combination could be giving something from one angle and then something quite different for another. But I highlight this example again is because the way in which retrograde planets from the medical, they're an adverse factor from a health medical point of view, and this would be an example, particularly as a sixth lord of accidents and injuries. Yes, someone has their hand up.
Yes, Mark, I just have a question about whether, like, for instance, if this Venus is stationary, I don't know if you plan to get to this or not, but I'm having a hard time determining, will it give it more benefic quality? And if it's a malefic, will it have more of a malefic quality? You said it's more powerful.
Well, it's more powerful. If you see these planets involved in yogas, right, you can reliably say that the source of strength will enable the yoga to manifest, truly. It won't be a no fruit yoga. It'll give its fruit to some degree, right? Now, you're bringing up another issue that we haven't talked about yet that I did mention in the article and showed a couple examples of, that when a planet is stationary, that is going from retrograde to direct or direct to retrograde, then it becomes extremely strong, right? But what is your question about that? I'm not sure I follow.
I guess just determining, because you said it's more of a powerful presence. So if it's a benefic, will it have given this native more protection in her case, do you think?
No. Remember what I said about strength. Don't confuse strength with influence.
Okay.
But you see, again, there's two sides. As a first lord combining with a second and fifth lord, it gave Raja and Danyoka and gave it pretty strongly.
Mm-hmm.
But as a retrograde sixth lord, right, it gave this other experience.
Okay.
You have to stay out of either or thinking.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just one or the other, it's both.
Thank you.
Sure. Now,
That health problem I think is better seen from the moon. I think it's seen better.
well, we haven't talked about this, but yeah, I mean, if you see these combinations from the moon, you can see again why, such an experience could happen in the Mercury-Venus period, but it can be correctly predicted from the birth logna as well. Okay. So, but, also Venus and Mercury continue to form Raja Yoga from the moon, meaning that now Mercury becomes the first lord. They exchange places. Now Mercury becomes the first lord and Venus becomes the fifth lord. Now it is going into the eighth house, which has its own meaning. All right.
Can I ask a question, Mark?
Sure, always need them up.
There's no grahas in the Kendra and there are no grahas around the moon. Is this person, does she feel very isolated, he or she, or?
Well, what prevents this from being a chemical? I mean, this moon is quite afflicted, right? It's with
Yes.
aspected by Mars.
It's
or by
eclipse kind of, yeah.
Right, but it's a completely full moon. But what's the saving grace here? Well, what prevents this from being a chemical moon?
Jupiter aspect of the moon.
Yeah, Jupiter's aspect from the moon. But one thing I didn't mention here too is that I am of the opinion that, and you've heard me say this earlier, that when Venus is retrograde, this is not a favorable factor in terms of love relationships and marriage, right? And there's clear indications here for delay in marriage, not hard to see. Saturn influences the seventh lord and also influences the seventh house, and Venus is retrograde. But I actually predicted marriage in Mercury Venus. I was doing this as much from the Jaime point of view as from the Parashari point of view, but it turned out to be correct. But it's delayed, right? She didn't marry until her early 40s. Okay, so
Mark, what happened to the child? Mark, we discussed this in previous one, the child thing. Did that positive thing happen, or?
Sorry?
We discussed this previously, for having a child in this Mercury Venus period. Did that manifest, or?
No, but I've actually predicted the birth of a child, but that's still to come. But it didn't happen in Mercury Venus. So I'm going to pull up the chart of now a name people should recognize, famous person. Also with the idea of retrograde Venus. So who is Condoleezza Rice?
Used to be in the Obama administration.
Yes,
Secretary of State,
politician.
George Bush.
Well, not really a politician. Not really a politician. For a long time, she held a very significant. She was provost, which is a very high position at Stanford University. She was a professor of political science there, but then got brought into the Bush administration first as the national security advisor and then as Secretary of State. Quite a brilliant woman, just incredibly intelligent, smart, a very impressive person in so many different ways. And you can see rather an extraordinary chart. What's distinctive feature really just stands out in this chart just at a glance.
9-10 Raja Yoga.
Well, this combination in Libra, right? We've got it's combination of Venus as the Yoga Karaka 5th and 10th Lord with Saturn as the not first Lord, and then also Mercury as the 9th Lord. Sun, of course, is also there. But if you know anything about her history, I mean, it's the exalted planets, or at least the planets in their exaltation sign, because some of that sort of gets reversed, or not reversed, but it gets a little dequalified as a result of Saturn here is in its debilitation sign in Navamsha. Mars here is exaltation sign in the birth chart gives to its debilitation sign in Navamsha, right? But this woman never married, never had children. So, come to Venus again as being retrograde, natural karaka of love and love relationships. And then also, what are the influence? What pattern related to her seventh house, seventh lord could indicate, no marriage.
Saturn, Mars, both aspect the seventh house.
And where's the seventh lord go, Neelima?
And seventh lord goes 12 away in Rahu Ketu axis.
Seventh lord goes to 12 away from the seventh house, but goes to the sixth house, right? Under the influence of Rahu. So you have really all malefic. I mean, you've got an exalted Jupiter there in the seventh, but it's also aspected by Saturn and Mars. So you have Karaka of children under this influence of Saturn and Mars. You've got Venus as a retrograde fifth lord, also under the influence of Saturn. And Venus as the natural karaka of love and love relationships. So you can see here how the influence of natural malefics, but also the karaka indications here are being influenced in a certain way that resulted in her destiny of not ever having married or not ever having had children, right? And, in the next article, in part 2, I'm going to be looking specifically at charts where a certain planet graha is retrograde and then a person ran that period and what results it did in fact produce. So you'll see that starting in 2007, she moved into her Venus major period. Her tenure as Secretary of State ended in 2008 when then Obama became president, replaced the Bush administration. But what happened is, again, how would you interpret this Venus in a positive sort of way? Would you see it as having a double source of strength, being both in its own sign, but also strength due to its retrograde motion? And then, what sub periods within the Venus major period might show even additional career rise?
Venus, Mercury.
Venus, Mercury would be a logical choice. Would there be another one?
Venus, Jupiter.
Venus, Saturn.
All three of those, right? So what happened is that, she went back to Stanford and became affiliated with something called the Hoover Institute, which is both a part of Stanford and also somewhat independent from it. It's a very high level, for lack of a better word, think tank, right? And anyway, starting in Venus Saturn, she got elevated to being the director of the Hoover Institute. Because one thing that needs to be seen here is this combination, not just from the birth log, but what does this combination become from the moon?
Or 5.
Maharaja.
Well, it becomes the Lagna Lord in the fifth with the fifth Lord and also the ninth Lord, right?
Mm.
So, becomes quite a Raja Yoga giving combination. And again, it's one of the things that explains, because, you might say Venus would give her their greatest, status as a position, but it was actually K2. Because remember, Bush was elected in the year 2000. So then it was right in K2 Venus that she became the national security advisor. And then later on, I think it would have been maybe K2 Jupiter, where she becomes the Secretary of State in the second, the second administration of Bush. So think about,
Mark, is the moon
hold on,
forming?
Sonali, hold on, please, until I'm finished speaking here. So K2, if you're using it both as a dasha lagna, which would also be consistent with the moon lagna, you have to see what happens to the fifth house from there. All right, so somebody had a question, and then Sonali, you can ask your question or make an observation. Somebody had their hand up.
Yes, Mark, would Venus being within a degree of the sun, is Cazimi considered a source of strength?
Well, some of you have seen my article where I did showing my research that way, that such a planet, rather than becoming burnt and therefore rendered incapable of giving its results or having those results be reduced, they actually become, something of a powerhouse. Because what I'm always looking at, what results did in fact the planet give? And, this Venus period has her in, very high status type positions in an academic environment. Not really as significant a position as she got in her K2 Venus sub period, right, where she becomes the national security advisor. But, what result is it giving, and in what way is that predictable, and what principles are then also coming into play here, right? So this is the only way I can answer that question.
Mark, because the previous person mentioned the strength of Venus, it's worth noting that she was big time into music.
Yes, she's accomplished. She's a very accomplished musician, isn't she? I think she even performs.
Yep.
Saraswati.
Yeah, there's Saraswati Yoga here, and it applies both from the birth lagna and from the moon, right? So good point, and I'm glad you brought that out. Glad you highlighted that.
And sun lagnas.
Yes, yes. So I'm bringing up another chart here. The chart of Amy Winehouse, who was singer-songwriter, kind of, well, she's a tragic case in the sense that she died from alcohol poisoning at a very young age, but had rather a meteoric rise in the movie industry, starting at a very, very young age in her Venus major period, right? Which, in fact, even as a child, she was involved heavily in some orchestral music. But obviously, starting moving into her late teens, early 20s, she ran the Venus major period up to age 23. Why are we talking about this Venus? We can see that it's retrograde. Now, but it's got a lot of other different conditions here, some favorable, some unfavorable. What would be some very favorable thing about this Venus?
Jupiter aspect.
Gets the aspect of Jupiter, right? So that's a favorable. Something about its condition.
Exalted in Naumaj.
So it goes through its exaltation sign in Navamsha, but then looking at its degrees, this puts it in its exaltation sign, but what other sort of condition does it also put it in?
Gandanta.
It's in a Gandanta position, and who's nakshatra?
Mercury.
Mercury.
But what's, it's Mercury's nakshatra, but it's also, who is the nakshatra and what are some of the
Ashlesha nakshatra.
Ashlesha nakshatra, which
Poison.
Poisons, addictions, which of course, does this Venus have any affliction?
Well, it's with Marika, 7th Lord Mars, which is also the 12th Lord, self-doing.
And aspected by?
Inspected by Saturn.
Right, so it's a pretty complex configuration here. You've got a Lagna Lord Venus, strong in the third house of performance and things like songwriting. Does it form any Raja Yoga?
Yeah, it's a 1-7 with Mars.
Right. The combination of Mars and Venus are a Raja Yoga combination. Neelama mentioned the aspect of Jupiter. It's got strength in two ways. If we take its retrogression as also a source of strength, but then goes to Pisces in the Vaj. So it was, and then somebody mentioned it's in Mercury's nakshatra. You've all seen my article and have heard me talk about the idea of Udu's clue. Does Mercury as a graha, does it form any Raja Yoga?
4 or 5 with the Sun in the 4th house.
Right. So, principle from the Laghu Parashari, when a planet gives the potential for the fruit of Raja Yoga, when will it do so? It will do so in the sub-periods that help form the Raja Yoga or in the sub-periods that give a similar result. And then, of course, with Venus also, Udu's clue in Mercury's nakshatra was right in Venus-Mercury that she had her first big breakthrough. Produced an album that got a lot of attention, was very successful both commercially and artistically, and also had a song in there that won some major, songwriting or song of the year type of award. And then actually even greater success in the subsequent period of Venus K2. Right? Where in her chart, though, would be the additional indication that she might struggle with drug and alcohol addiction, besides her Lagna Lord being in Ashleisha with quite a bit of affliction.
Rahu.
Of course, Rahu within 2 degrees, 3 degrees of the ascendant, right? Had to be a contributing factor as well.
And also Mark, Moon in the 8th house with an aspect of Saturn, which is not good for the mind.
Right. So Manas disturbance there as a result of this moon here in the 8th house with this, it mentions aspect of Saturn. Just since I have her chart up here, I've used this chart as an example of how when a person in Charadasha runs the period of a planet in the 8th house, and it's like the DK, right? Which serves as the Maraka in the Gemini system. I forget what the sub-period is. It might have been Virgo, but the major period where she, died of alcohol poisoning was Sagittarius. Okay.
Sun Ketu is when she passed away, is what I remember.
Say again?
Sun Ketu is
Sun
when
Ketu.
she,
Yeah.
Sun Ketu.
Yeah. Okay. So you've worked on this chart before. Did Penny use it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a Viparit Raja Yoga too, which brought her so much fame. Yeah.
Right. So on a happier note here, bringing up the chart of the very famous French author Alexandre Dumas, which again, many of you probably have seen before as I've used it to illustrate sort of different things, but I'm showing it here as it relates to the retrograde Mercury, right? So Mercury would be, again, if you take retrogression as a source of strength, Mercury here would have three sources of strength, would it not? What would those be besides, if you take retrogression?
It's a directional strength.
What else?
Vargottama.
It's Vargottama, right? And of course, it was one of the planets of authorship. What sort of yoga is it forming here in the first house?
It's a Buddha Aditya Yoga.
Buddha Ditya Yoga that, I think it's far enough away from the sun that you wouldn't see that there's, an issue of combustion primarily. And, he wasn't just a novelist, which is more of a fifth house, fifth lord, Jupiter sort of thing. He was also a playwright, very prolific playwright. And you can see Mercury here is also ruling the third house, which relates more to, playwrights, screenplays, things like that. And, it did give its results extremely strongly here. Some of you may remember, I've highlighted this. Well, the two planets of authorship, Jupiter and Mercury, both of them have sources of strength here. What's Jupiter's source of strength?
It's Vargottama.
It's Vargottama. And in the very first article I wrote for the Jyotish Journey entitled A Literary Love Affair, I was highlighting and showing a number of examples in which very, very famous authors ended up writing their most famous works in either Mercury Jupiter or Jupiter Mercury. And this was true for him. He, at age 40, for a period of just under 3 years, he ran Jupiter Mercury, and it was during this period that he wrote and published the two novels for which he's most remembered, some of the most beloved and most widely read novels in all of literature, The Three Musketeers, and then also The Count of Monte Cristo. So this is again sort of an example of how some planet might get triple strength as a result of it being retrograde, besides being both Vargottama and getting directional strength. Somebody had their hands up?
Yeah, Mark, you may have just answered my question. So Mercury's dignity in the Rashi is a neutral, but because it's retrograde and goes into its own sign, does that improve its dignity?
No, you mean the fact if you could be seen as being aspecting also from Gemini? Does it?
Yes.
No, then does it become Swan? The answer is no. You can't. I mean, I wouldn't think of it in that way. It's in Cancer, right? And so in determining its dignity, you have to see, its dignity in terms of what its relationship with the moon is, in terms of. But you see, what all of that, any kind of consideration of dignity gets trumped. Oh, I don't want to use that word. Gets overridden, you might say, by Mercury's really intense strength in other ways. Again, Vargottama, directional, and retrograde. Does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so just a moment here. I want to see where I want to go next with this. Okay, so this is bringing up the chart of Russian student of mine, someone I got to know well. They hosted me when I was in Moscow. Some of you may recognize the chart because it was a chart in which I predicted the birth of a child of hers within less than a 24-hour period. But the reason I'm wanting to show this chart is the Venus, right? So for anyone with Scorpio Lagna, Venus as a seventh lord placed in the 12th need not be a bad thing if it was just in its own sign and that was the only consideration. And I can remember a chart that I saw, a Russian woman who actually married an Italian man and ended up then living in Italy in her Venus major period. So obviously one of the things that can happen when, in this case, when the seventh lord goes to the 12th in its own sign, one can marry a foreigner and end up living in a foreign country, which was the case there. But this Venus is retrograde, and then also what unfavorable things are happening with it.
Papa Kartari,
So
an
it's,
aspect by Saturn.
right, it gets malefic hemming. We have to consider, the planets in Scorpio, because Mercury is only with other malefics, then it becomes malefic, and then Rahu is on the other side. And then there's also the aspect of Saturn, right? So you can see that this person ran their Venus major period starting at age 8, became at age 28. But predictably, they had some, I would just say, some highly unfavorable sorts of experiences in their, they married early, they married in their Venus Mahadasha, but had some, pretty unfavorable experiences within marriage. And ended up divorcing also in that period, which would be fairly predictable as a result of Venus being retrograde, number one, but then also you have one factor coming on top of another, which is the additional affliction here. And then, of course, in Venus Saturn, this would have brought out some of the, not good potentials of this at all, right? So in the next article, as I mentioned, I'm going to be highlighting again, retrograde planets, and then what actually happened in those periods, and how a retrograde condition can be favorable on one side. It can be a source of strength for a planet, but can harm natural significations and be problematic in another way. And this is why, I could consider retrograde planets to be something of an enigma. Because of the way they can, sort of give these very disparate type of results. So this is what I had to share with you today. Nice to see you all again. I hadn't seen Peter and Nilima and Ramanya for a while, so nice to see you here. And part 2 will come out. I'm not sure where exactly in November, but here's one I want to make a request. Some of you might have retrograde planets in your charts, right? Some of you may have run those periods, right? So if you're willing to share your birthday with me anonymously, I don't need to get your name involved, and share with me what your experience was during that, period of a retrograde planet that you ran, either good or bad, right? I'd be very much interested. I'd actually rather use those examples coming from people in the program here rather than, examples just from, celebrities and famous people. So anyone who's willing to volunteer, you would have my gratitude and appreciation. Okay. So we will end as we normally do with unless there's any thoughts or questions that people want to share about their own observations about retrograde planets, or any question about anything we've discussed today, we can take those now.
Mark,
Rohit?
Mark, I think you have read BPHS. So obviously there is about retrogression in BPHS. Is there any remarks about retrogression by Maharishi Gemini?
Not that I'm aware of. Now, you'll see in the next, I put some quotes from classics in this article, right? And you'll see more of those in the next thing. But, I also talked about Ken Rao's admonition that even though he revered the classics, and obviously you have to pay attention to what's in the classics, sometimes to adopt some principle from statement in the classics, you're going to go wrong if you can take it as a dogma, right? So you have to be careful about that too. But no, I have not seen anything with regards to retrograde planets in the Jaimini Sutras itself. Of course, we don't have all of what existed in the Jaimini Sutras. I haven't even seen anything, comments about it in commentarial literature. And I never can remember Ken Rao making some sort of comment from the Jaimini point of view because a planet was retrograde.
Yeah, that's why I asked, thinking, do we even take retrogression when we're looking at Achara Dasha?
Well, not certainly in terms of its calculation.
Yeah, but in relation to the effects.
So in other words, if I'm seeing the sign containing a retrograde planet, do I do some interpretation based on that? My answer is no.
Yeah, that's what. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anything else before we conclude? Okay. Ahom asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mitruma amritam gamaya sarvesham shashvitvatu sarvesham shanti bhavatu sarvesham purnam bhavatu sarvesham mangalam bhavatu loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Ahom shanti shanti shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat.